Hello, and welcome back to the competitive biography of Emanuel Lasker. Today we will be taking our final look at the Breslau 1889 Hauptturnier. Given that Emil von Feyerfeil was unable to hold the draw against Paul Lipka at our previous discussion, he and Lasker tie for first place with 4 out of 6, and thus one more tie-break game must be played in order to determine who wins the overall tournament and who ultimately wins the title of Master within the German Chess Federation. Because our previous discussion was so long, I'm going to jump right into the game to hopefully save a little bit of time. In this final, all-important game, von Feyerfeil has the white pieces, and this time he opens with the move d4. Lasker responds d5, and we have our first look at the London system, bishop to f4. Nowadays, the London system is perhaps the most widely played opening in all of chess. In this particular time, it was primarily championed by the English player James Mason, who, for example, scored 2.5 out of 4 with it at the New York 1889 tournament, including a 13-move win over Mikhail Chigorin that we'll take a look at in a second. Now, knight to f6 and e6 have been the most common responses in this decade, but here Lasker goes for a newer innovation, c5. This marks the Steinitz counter gambit, as it was played by none other than world champion Wilhelm Steinitz starting at the London 1883 tournament. So I guess technically not world champion yet. Here, Feyerfeil plays d captures on c5. That game against Chigorin I mentioned flicked in a trade on b8 first, and only now d captures c5. The game continued queen to a5 with check and knight to c3, e6, e4, bishop captures c5, e captures d5, knight to f6, bishop to b5 check, and here king to e7. This position was actually reached twice in the tournament. d6 check would be played in a later round against the American player Max Judd, but James Mason would ultimately go on to lose this game. Against Chigorin, he played the better move knight to f3, and after knight captures on d5, he set a little trap with queen to d2. Chigorin walked into it by playing knight captures on c3, where after queen to g5 with check, f6, queen captures c5 with check, king to f7, and bishop to e8 with check, it was here on move 13 that Chigorin resigned the game as he simply loses his queen for nothing. It feels weird, I'll admit, that for both of the games between Feyerfeil and Lasker, I've been able to talk about a game that Chigorin lost at a tournament he won, as he co-won the New York 1889 tournament. It's a really weird pattern, but anyway, getting back to our regularly scheduled programming, d captures on c5 was played right away in this game, and in the game against Steinitz. Knight to c6, knight to f3, and now f6. And it turns out that playing a Queen's Gambit accepted, a tempo down, is actually quite reasonable for black if that tempo was spent on the move bishop to f4, because e5 is a really annoying move to stop. Now here Feyerfeil plays the move e3, still following the flagship game, but from an objective standpoint it's incorrect. The best move technically is e4, but one can see how crazy it gets. For example, following d captures on e4, you really have to trade queens here. So after queen captures on d8, there are arguments to be made for both recaptures, but let's say knight captures d8 to keep castling rights. Knight f to d2 and now e5, bishop to e3, and now black even plays f5. f4 is a huge threat. Best would be to meet it through knight to c4, so that on f4 you can play bishop to d2. Bishop captures c5, knight captures e5, and now knight to e6, defending the f4 pawn. These two advanced pawns probably should be overextended and vulnerable, but it feels like white is really playing with fire. I can understand why this would be equal, but I don't think I would be necessarily comfortable with white here. But e3 was played, so that on e5, bishop to g3, and now bishop captures on c5. Lasker now regains his pawn. c3, knight g to e7, and knight b to d2 were all still played in that flagship game, and only here we deviate. Steinitz here chose bishop to b6. The game continued bishop to e2, both players castled. Knight to f5, of course Steinitz loved going after the bishop pair. And after e4, knight captures g3, h captures g3, d4. And Steinitz would go on to use his bishop pair to win this game in only 30 moves. Here Lasker deviates by playing bishop to e6, and so it's as of move 8 that the players are playing a unique game. Now here Lasker indicates that he doesn't really mind seeing knight to b3, but Feyerfeil doesn't play it, so it's all fine. Queen to a4. Lasker responds to this with a6, and after rook to d1, b5, kicking the queen back to c2. This was arguably a better square than a4 in the first place, but after queen to c8, the real move that's worth criticizing is a3. Now the tournament book really rips into Feyerfeil for this move, saying that it's more than just useless, but actively harmful due to this hole now created on b3. That hole will come up again, I promise. If he was playing this move to prevent the b-pawn from advancing, the tournament book also provides the following line, starting with the natural bishop to e2, castles, castles, and b4, as he was trying to prevent. Here they recommend knight to b3, and after the bishop retreats, they can push the c-pawn, and they say we don't see the slightest danger for him. And indeed, if you get to strike at the central pawns like this, white's life should be made a whole lot easier. But okay, a3 was played, so the b-pawn is definitely not advancing now. Castles, and now bishop to e2. Here you don't have to allow white to castle. Lasker plays bishop to f5, kicking the queen down to c1, and now he plays a nice patient move, rook to a7. He's in no rush to get himself fully developed. This lets him slide the rook around without moving his queen again. Here Feyerfeil castles, and now Lasker even goes as far as to play g5. He's playing moves like this which just completely paralyze Feyerfeil. White has no pawn breaks. e4 and c4 are sufficiently defended. a4 would be met with b4 and nothing really opens. Even h4 here runs into not just g4 but potentially h5 as well. What does white have here? The tournament book offers knight to b3, and then once the bishop retreats, you can follow this up with rook to d2 and knight to e1. I suppose it's better than what would end up being played in the game, but that's not necessarily saying much. Here Feyerfeil plays the move rook f to e1. Now it doesn't immediately look like it, but this is an attempt to double the rooks on the d file. It's a slowed idea, but again, he doesn't really have anything immediate. After king to h8, the f1 square has been vacated, so knight to f1. Queen to e6, and now the d2 square has been vacated, so rook to d2. Rook to d7 by Lasker, and finally rook e to d1. So now Feyerfeil has doubled his rooks and can start to look to make something happen on the d file. Unfortunately for him, this is a blunder that loses material by force. So what I want you to do, pause the video, see if you can find the move that Lasker played here that really threw a wrench into Feyerfeil's plans. It's not a very difficult move to find, I don't think. If you remember the hole on b3, it's coming up again here. Lasker played the move knight to a5. Now, if it was Lasker to move knight to b3, would just straight up trap the queen. As is here, Feyerfeil does get one move to play the move b4, but knight to b3 still comes with a fork, and he wins the exchange. Queen to b2, knight captures d2, rook captures d2, and he retreats his bishop back to a7. So here, Feyerfeil is down the exchange with basically no compensation. He arguably has negative compensation as he's still lacking space, and this pawn on c3 is now incredibly weak. Things are dire, to say the least. He starts trying to look for something with a4. Okay, this pawn is under-defended. Rook to b7 defends it. A captures b5, a captures b5, and now rook down to d1. Queen to c6, and now knight 1 to d2. Now here's Feyerfeil undoing his previous development scheme. This game is actually kind of sad. I would perhaps not show it if it wasn't so crucial, admittedly, but here we are. Bishop to e6 from Lasker, and now h3. Rook to c8, pressuring the pawn even further, and Feyerfeil continues defending with rook to c1. I think if he was looking for a more combative option, like we saw at the end of the previous game, c4 is a move that comes to mind. After b captures on c4 here, there are a couple of really nice moves that come up all in a row here, starting with bishop captures on e5. Black doesn't have time to play c3 due to bishop captures on f6 and things opening up against the king. And on f captures e5, queen captures on e5 with check. King to g8 is forced, and now another really nice move from white, knight to e4. Here knight to f6 is a threat, and if you take, rook to d6. And now white is going to win a little bit of material back if they were able to capture here on e6. But in this position, black is up so much material that they're even able to play queen captures on d6. Queen captures d6, and now bishop to d5, and ultimately black should still win this, but there are at least some material imbalances now, and white can look for something. It's certainly not going to be much, and I do believe that black should end up winning this game, but you're looking for whatever chances you can get in this sort of position. But okay, Feyerfeil continues defending. We have rook to c1 instead, and now knight to f5. Bishop back to h2. Of course, you don't want to trade pieces if you don't have to, but here comes e4 from Lasker. The knight drops down to e1, and now d4. Here, knight captures on e4, and the tournament book does somewhat correctly note that on queen captures e4, bishop to f3 would be best for white, but believe it or not, this is still winning for black. D captures on e3, and after bishop captures on e4, e captures on f2 with check. Now white could immediately give the queen back, and I'm sure it would be obvious why this is still good for black. I think the more challenging line would follow after king to f1, and for want of time, I'll say that after rook to e7, eventually black is going to take here on e1. The king is vulnerable to threats like bishop to c4, knight to e3, and overall this king will be caught in tactics that will return the material balance in favor of black with interest. Here Lasker instead opted for d captures on e3, still completely winning. f3 is now the knight can be taken, and bishop to c4 from black. After king to h1, bishop captures on e2. Not too many ways you can avoid a trade here. Queen captures on e2, and now bishop back to b8. Playing bishop to g1 just condemns your bishop to passivity for the rest of the game, so he trades here. Bishop captures on b8, rook b captures on b8, and now king to g1. g4 looks like a tempting move, trying to kick the knight so that you can take here on e3, but there's this cute little tactic. Queen captures on e4, just another queen sacrifice, why not? F captures e4, and now knight to g3 simply picks back up the queen. Game over. So king to g1 escapes this. Now g4 is a threat, and so Lasker defends his pawn through queen to b6. Here we have knight to d3 from Feyerfeil. After rook to e8, he plays knight d to c5, so he cuts off the queen's defense of the pawn. And now rook b to d8. Here comes g4 from Feyerfeil, now kicking the knight and opening up the e3 pawn to be captured. And Lasker allows it to happen by playing the move knight to h4. He misses a pretty brutal finish after rook captures on e4. The problem is that no matter which way you recapture this, rook to d2 is a threat. For example, on f captures e4, rook to d2 in this position, the issue is that there is no way to stop the queen from infiltrating along one of the dark squares and giving checkmate. While on knight captures e4, here rook to d2 after queen to e1, now knight to h4, f3 is going to fall, and white will fall with it. But okay, there's not necessarily anything wrong with knight to h4. After queen captures on e3, queen to c7, there are still threats of the queen infiltrating on the dark squares. After rook to f1, you could really play the move queen to g3 just automatically. After knight captures on g3, rook captures e3, and one of these pawns are going to fall, and white's house of cards just crumbles. Lasker decides to move his knight back to g6, and after queen to f2, he puts it on f4. Okay, this still threatens the h3 pawn, so fine. Queen to h2 defends it, and now queen to e5. Here rook to b1 from Feyerfeil, and now queen to d5. This feels like Lasker is just playing for tricks, admittedly. Knight captures on f6 is the move that Lasker is trying to bait Feyerfeil into playing. This would allow yet another queen sacrifice. Queen to d1 with check. After rook captures d1, rook captures d1 with check. King to f2 is forced, and now rook to e2 with check. King to g3, and after rook d to d2, a black rook will deliver checkmate on g2. Feyerfeil doesn't fall for it. He plays queen to c2. This gives up the h3 pawn, so knight captures on h3 with check. King to h2, and after the knight goes back to f4, now Feyerfeil plays knight captures on f6. Now, if this doesn't work, nothing will. This still comes with a fork. He's threatening checkmate here on h7. He's got to try something, but unfortunately for Feyerfeil, it doesn't work here either. Lasker played queen to d2 with check, and it was here on move 47 that Emil von Feyerfeil resigned the game and resigned the Breslau 1889 Hauptturnier altogether in favor of Emanuel Lasker. The problem here is that things are forced, the queen trade has to be made, and after rook captures on d2 with check, the king is forced onto the back rank as king to g3 is mated right away. So let's say king to h1 and now rook e to e2. And white can't stop mate. Any move he plays will run into rook to h2 with check, rook to g2 with check, and because this rook is defended by the knight, rook to h1 can be played with checkmate. So yeah, that's the game. Like I said, not a very interesting game. This was lost very early on. Honestly, I would quite possibly say that it was lost as early as move 3 with this move e3. It's a very complicated position, but I do think this has to be played. But as soon as Lasker won the exchange, following knight to a5, this was just over when Feyerfeil had no chance to come back. So where do we go from here? Well, that is the end of the Hauptturnier, of course, with this Lasker, with his title of master, has been invited to the next German Chess Federation Master Congress, but that wouldn't be for in the ballpark of 2 to 3 years. His master title earned him an invitation to another tournament that would be played a month from this. So we'll be looking at a more recent tournament that will be the focus of our next video and will, I assure you, have more interesting players and by extension more interesting games. You have that to look forward to, and I look forward to seeing you there. Until then.